I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you tonight to kick this lectureship off. As Bruce said, the theme of the lectureship is the Christian and civil government. And my particular topic is going to be Jesus and civil government. You know, in Romans chapter 13, verses 3 and 4, Paul gives in just broad strokes the purpose of civil government. He says, "For our rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon all who doeth evil." Now, so in general then, the purpose of civil government is to reward and protect those who do good, and to punish those who do evil. And understanding that doing good and doing evil is government's definition of which one is which. But as a common sense, it dictates that this must be taken generally, rather than saying that every government is going to take care of good people, because, well, every government is actually run by fallible men. So the government's not going to be any better than the ones who are in power. And we realize that justice is not always going to be done as it should be done. But Paul goes on to say there that they'll not bear the sword in vain. The sword meaning they have the authority to administer punishment. And he says that not in vain, meaning they have the sword for a good reason. And so the government has the right and the responsibility to enforce the law. And the government then is declared to be the minister or servant of God. Now, to gain a fuller appreciation of Jesus' attitude and relationship toward civil government, I think it's necessary to know a little bit about the Roman government and the Jews' attitude toward that government. And you know, there was a great blow to the Jews to be conquered by the Romans. It was a blow to their national pride. They believed that they were a chosen people and they were special, and that they looked forward to the day when all the nations of the world would come to Jerusalem to worship. And instead, the Romans and their puppet rulers desecrated their holy places and insulted their laws and their customs. Of course, one of the most hated aspects of the Roman domination was the heavy taxation. The provinces were expected to bear the burden of the cost of administering the empire. I thought it was interesting to look into this and find that in the province of Syria, where we're talking about here, there was an income tax of 1%. You think, that's not bad. No, that's not bad. But there was also export, import taxes, levies on crops, 1/10 of the grain crop, 1/5 of the wine, fruit, and oil, purchase taxes, taxes payable on the transfer of property, emergency taxes, and so on. Sounds like the U.S., doesn't it? Now, the fact that we're having this lectureship in April, right after April 15th, is strictly coincidence. But the Roman officials called a censor was responsible for collecting the revenue, but he sold that right to extort it to the highest bidders. And these tax collectors then demanded more money than was due, and kept the difference for themselves. That was their pay. It's also likely they took bribes from the rich, so it wound up that the poor folks were the ones who were paying for the cost of the empire. The Sanhedrin was the Jewish council of 70 elders and the high priest, which met in Jerusalem. And the Sanhedrin had control over the religious affairs, but also administered government and justice under the authority of the Roman procurator. And it tried criminal cases, but it did not have the authority to enforce capital punishment. That's why they had to take Jesus to Pilate, the Roman governor, to enforce the capital punishment. Now, I want to look at Jesus' family life shortly, but before I do, I want to look at just a few things that Scriptures has to say about family, realizing that the family that we're going to describe here would obviously be the family of Joseph and Mary. Now, Jehovah God instituted the family all the way back into the beginning of Genesis. The family is the very foundation of society. And the failure of the family unit is why so many of our problems are with us today here in the United States. In Genesis 2 and 7, we're told that the Lord formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And then a little later in verse 18, God said, "It's not good that man should be alone. I'll make for him a helpmeet." So Adam and Eve formed the first marriage, the first home, if you will. And then God laid down some rules throughout the Bible of what a family is supposed to be. For example, in Ephesians 5:23, it says the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. And in verse 28 of that same chapter, it says, "You fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord." That was Ephesians 6:4. Ephesians 5:28 says, "You men ought to love your wives as your own bodies." And of course, you're all familiar with the Proverbs 22:6. "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he'll not depart from it." So these are just some general guidelines for the husband or the father. But you also have some rules for wives. He says, Ephesians 5:22, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord." And Titus 2 and 5 says, "To be discreet, chaste, keepers at home, good, obedient to their own husbands." And of course, he laid down some rules for children. It says, "Children," Ephesians 6 verses 1 and 2, "obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with promise." Now, for a home to be all that God wants it to be, requires a joint effort of husband, wife, and children. And of course, the husband bearing the ultimate responsibility of the home. Now, Jesus actually lived under two civil laws, when you get right down to it. The Roman law as well as the law of Moses. The law of Moses, you know, was both civil law and God's law. So the parents then, under that law of Moses, were commanded not only to keep the commandments, but also in Deuteronomy 6:7, it says, "And thou shalt teach them," that is your children, "diligently, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up." So you're to keep the commandments of the Lord. You're to teach those commandments to your children. Of course, that principle is carried over into the New Covenant also. And I have no doubt that Joseph and Mary were chosen they were put in place because of their outstanding faith and character and the family that they would create. They would have been considered by God in the same way that he considered Abraham. In Genesis 18 and 19 it says, "For I know him," that is, I know Abraham, "and he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring Abraham that which he had spoken of him." So Jesus' earthly parents, that is, Joseph and Mary, we realize Joseph wasn't the father, but his earthly parents then had respect for the civil law. They taught that respect for all living under their roof, including Jesus as well as the rest of the family. And you remember in Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, where Joseph and Mary came to register for the census. It says, "It came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Augustus Caesar that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made by Cyrenius, who was governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, everyone to his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth unto Judea, unto the house of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, who his espoused wife, being great with child. Now I realize this is before Jesus was born, but it's a demonstration of the respect for the civil law that Joseph and Mary had, and then no doubt taught that in their family. So Jesus, as well as the rest of the family, would have been taught respect for the civil law, but also respect for spiritual law, both by the actions of the parents and by their teaching. You know, I've often tried to think, especially since preparing this lesson, I've often tried to think of what kind of a child was Jesus? You know, before the age of 12, the scriptures don't tell us anything about Jesus. Now, I can just imagine a bright-eyed boy learning to read the scriptures at his mother's knee, running in and out of the cottage or perhaps the carpenter shop, joining with other children in innocent pastimes, just playing with the other kids. And Luke 2, verse 40 said, he grew and waxed strong, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him. Now, at the age of 12, he's taken by Joseph and Mary to Jerusalem, and you know that story, how that he was left behind in Jerusalem. And when Joseph and Mary came back and found him, he was in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. He had that kind of knowledge and wisdom at the age of 12. Now, I know he was and is God, and I understand that, but he is also human. Before he reached the age of accountability, I've often wondered, you reckon Joseph ever had to take him out behind the woodshed? I can't imagine that. But we do know that a small child needs discipline. And we think about the terrible twos. I don't know if Jesus went through those or not. But I do know that the scriptures tell us that Jesus had to learn obedience, Hebrews 5 and 8, by the things which he suffered. So I'm assuming that there was a learning process even as a child, even as God, because he was human. And we're told over and over in the New Testament that he was every bit as human as we are. And I know I got taken out behind the woodshed a few times. Fortunately, that's not a question that I have to deal with, particularly in this lesson, so we'll let that go. But by their teaching and their example, Joseph and Mary obviously set an example for Jesus to respect civil law. Now, by that same act of registering for the census as well as others, Joseph and Mary taught Jesus the importance not only of respect for civil law, but also obedience. Everything about that Roman occupation was hateful for the Jews. They hated that. From the oppressive taxes to the physical abuse by the Roman soldiers to the repugnant idea that the Roman leader was God. You know, they made Caesar out to be God. You're supposed to bow down and worship Caesar. And you know, taxes have always been with us. They were with the Jews before the taken under Roman occupation. And in fact, the civil portion of Israel's theocracy was supported by tax money. Matthew 17 and 24 says, when they were come to Capernaum, they that received tribute money came to Peter and said, does your master not pay tribute? And he says, yes. And when he was coming into the house, Jesus prevented him. That is, Jesus knew what he was coming in there for to begin with, so he didn't have to ask. He said, what thinkest thou, Simon? Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Of their own children or of strangers? And Peter saith unto him, of strangers. So Jesus said unto him, then are the children free. Notwithstanding, lest we should offend them, go thou to the sea, and cast a hook take up the fish that first cometh up, and when he's opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money. Take that and give to the collectors for you and me. And Jack, I didn't see any money in those fish's mouth that we caught here a couple of weeks ago when we went fishing. So this was something a little different. But basically what Jesus is saying here is, I'm not, as the Son of God, I'm not required to pay this tax or this tribute. But I will, just to avoid the appearance of impropriety. And many times we do that, is we do things just so that we don't appear to be doing something in spite of the government or in spite of someone. So don't want any impropriety to be even suspected. Now, taxes have always been a great source of frustration to many people down through the ages. Like I say, that's one of the big reasons why the United States is here, was taxation. But under the Roman occupation of Judea, the tax collectors were just really despised by the Jews. But look at how the master teacher approaches the problem of taxes in Matthew 22, verses 15 to 21. It says, Then went the Pharisees and took counsel of how they might entangle him in his talk. And they sent him out unto him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, Master, we know that thou art true, and teachest the way of God in truth. Neither carest thou for any man, for thou regardest not the person of men. Now that phrase, at first reading, you might think, Jesus knows you don't like anybody. That's not what he's saying. He's saying he shows no respect of persons. He says, Tell us therefore, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not? But Jesus perceived their wickedness, and said, Why tempt ye me, you hypocrites? Show me the tribute money. And they brought him a penny, and he saith unto them, Whose image and superscription is on it? And they said, Caesar's. Then saith he unto them, Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Now, like I say, I realize this is our month to pay our income taxes, but those who wish not to pay taxes because of what they perceive as being oppressive amount extracted won't find any relief here from Jesus. And those who believe that sinful behavior of the government is not a reason to not pay taxes will be frustrated. Governments may do many things that are contrary to the will of God. The Roman government was as wicked as any other. They even subsidized idolatry. But Jesus is being consistent in stating the obligation to pay your taxes. Whoever is owed, whether national or local, the tax, you have an obligation to pay those taxes. We live in a country, fortunately, where we get a vote to say, have some say so in our civil government. Very few countries in the world have that privilege. Now, we may not control it as well as we would like to, but at least we have some say so. But Jesus' lesson here goes further than just paying taxes. It includes the giving of honor and respect to those to whom it's due. Paul spells it out in Romans 13 and 7. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor. We have entered a period of time in this country that it almost seems like it's the norm to disrespect authority. All of us, not just one side or the other. And we resent authority and we disrespect it in so many times. And we've got to get a handle on that for ourselves as well as the rest of society here in the United States. Just threw that in just for free. Consider for just a moment Jesus' attitude toward civil marriages or civil divorces. In John chapter 2, we see Jesus' tacit approval of the civil marriage tradition. He was there. He took part in the festivities. He even provided drinks for the guests, non-alcoholic, of course. Now, this was early in his ministry. he approved of that civil ceremony, the civil marriage. But sometime later we see that he does not approve of the civil law concerning divorce. Pharisees come to him, Matthew 19, verse 3, tempting him, saying unto him, Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause, that is, for any reason? And I love Jesus' response. He does this on more than one occasion. I could just see him picking up the scroll and say, Haven't you read the book? It's in the book. I could just picture him doing that. But Jesus then said one man and one woman, and we joke about this, but here lately we've been at the point where we have to emphasize that now. One man and one woman joined together by God, and what God has joined together, let no man, no civil law unjoin them. Now the Pharisees, of course, came right back in verse 7 and says, Why then did Moses command to give a writing of divorcement? And Jesus said unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say unto you that whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery. Now we're going to have a full discussion of this tomorrow by Brother David Brown, so I don't want to spend much time on it, but I wanted to point out Jesus' attitude toward civil government, and not just civil marriages, but the other institutions of civil government that he supports. The civil government has that right. Now, Jesus was not intimidated by civil government, and yet he did not resist the government. He submitted to the authority of the civil government with the understanding of where that authority originated. Jesus allowed himself to be taken prisoner without a struggle. He allowed himself to be brought before the Jewish Sanhedrin, before the high priest, before Pilate, and before Herod. In John chapter 18, excuse me, after Jesus' betrayal, he was brought before Annas, who asked about his teaching. What have you been teaching? And it's difficult to see emotion in the written word. And I realize that, but I just have it just seems to me that Jesus very calmly and very politely says, I've been speaking in public. Why don't you ask those people who heard me? Of course, the Roman soldier standing there beside him struck Jesus. And Jesus come back and said, if I've spoken evil, bear witness. But if why smitest thou me? Basically he said, if I'm telling the truth, why are you hitting me? If I'm not telling the truth, well then I got a problem with civil government. When he was brought before Pontius Pilate, Jesus refused to defend himself. In John 19, verses 10 and 11, Pilate therefore said to Jesus, Speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have the power to release you? I have the power to crucify you. And Jesus answered him and says, Thou wouldst have no power against me except it were given thee from above. And Jesus here alludes to that truth, which is elaborated at a later time by Paul in Romans 13 and 1, that regarding the state and civil authority as being God ordained. And we'll get discussion of that later in the series of lessons. But Jesus' application of this to Pilate was that reveals the hand of God in the affairs of state. Now, Pilate's being procurator at that particular time was not all Pilate's sole achievement, despite his arrogant assumption that it was. God had raised him up no less than he had raised up Esther in a previous time, when he says, raised him up for such a time as this. He was put in that place at that time for that purpose. Pilate's power of continuing in office was directly from God. and it was exercised only under God's permission. Now, Jesus might have called legions of angels to his defense. He even had the power to have changed Pilate's mind, or to prostrate that entire garrison there at Antonia. When I think about God's power over civil government, or using civil government to accomplish his purposes, I can't help but think about Isaiah 44, verse 28. Here through the prophet, he says, "Thus that saith of Cyrus," speaking of Cyrus, "He is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, Thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation will be laid." Now, you say, okay, what's so profound about this verse? Very simply, it's this. This prophecy was made approximately 150 years before Cyrus was born. And it was years before Judah went into captivity, much less came back out of captivity, Babylonian captivity. Yet by inspiration, Cyrus is called by name as the one who would deliver Judah and allow the Israelites to go back to Jerusalem. And very specifically, he said, you're going to be able to rebuild Jerusalem and lay the foundation of the temple. Not going to build the temple at that time, but you're going to be able to lay the foundation. Now the words there, he is my shepherd to perform my pleasure, is indication that he was under the direction of God and was employed in God's service. It wasn't just coincidence that Cyrus happened to become the head of the Babylonian Empire at that time. God put him there at that time for that reason. And we have many other examples of God's power over civil governments in the Old Testament, but I think that none of them are any more astounding than the one revealed to us in Acts 12, verses 21 through 23. It said, "Upon a set day, Herod arrayed himself in royal apparel, and sat on the throne, and made an oration unto them. And the people shouted, saying, The voice of a God, and not a man. And immediately the angel of the Lord smote him, because he gave not God the glory. And he was eaten of worms, and gave up the ghost." You think God wasn't in charge? I think he was. Now, Jesus' teachings and his actions taught that the kingdom was not and is not the enemy of civil government. And those people needed to understand that, and we need to understand that too. But in Matthew 26, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Judas betrayed Jesus, we have a demonstration of the difference in the Christ's kingdom and civil government. In verse 47, it says, "Judas, one of the 12, came, and with a great multitude, with swords and staves, from the chief priests and the elders of the people." Then in verse 51, against that great multitude, now think about what the courage of Peter. Peter's one man, and there's a multitude coming at him with swords and staves. I'm talking about spears, I suspect. He whips out his sword, cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest. And I doubt very seriously that he was aiming for the ear. But Jesus told him, put away your sword. And then according to Luke 22:51, Jesus healed that ear. And again, I can just picture Jesus maybe picking that ear up off the ground, maybe dusting it off, putting it back on. Now, I don't know if that's the way it happened. He might just grew a new ear. The point is, Jesus said, we're not going to fight. And I'm going to take care of the problem that you just made for us, Peter. And then a little later in Matthew 26:53, Jesus says, "Thinkest thou that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he shall presently give me more than 12 legions of angels?" At this point, the disciples did not understand what the kingdom was all about. They still expected it to be an earthly kingdom. And Jesus allowing himself to be taken prisoner was just beyond their understanding. The scripture says they all fled. Then when it was brought before Pilate, Jesus laid down a logical argument to Pilate, which Pilate accepted. In John 18, verse 36, Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should be delivered, not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. Now, I doubt that Pilate understood what the kingdom was all about either. But he knew enough prior to this meeting, and then these words from Jesus' own mouth, to know that Jesus was not any kind of threat to the secular throne of Caesar. And John 10, verses 17 through 18, it's going back early in his ministry, but shows you how Jesus approached this. He said, my Father doth love me because I lay down my life that I might take it again. No man taketh it from me. No man can take his life. But I lay it down myself. I have the power to lay it down, and I have the power to take it again. This commandment have I received of my Father. My Father gave me this authority, this responsibility. He said, I control whether I die or not, and when I die. And that shows that his death, of course, is voluntary. And the resurrection which followed was, of course, all part of God's perfect plan that he came up with before he even created the world for man's salvation. What it really amounts to is that we as Christians have a dual citizenship. We're citizens of the kingdom of heaven. We're also citizens of the kingdom of men. I'm a citizen of the United States, but I'm also a citizen of heaven. Now, Jesus understood and taught that our obedience to God supersedes all else, including civil government. Matthew 6:33, Jesus says, seek ye first the kingdom of God and all his righteousness, and all these other things will be added unto you. Now, I know that Jesus wasn't talking particularly about civil government, but the principle is there. God comes first. Jesus taught that principle. And the apostles over in Acts chapter 5, whenever they were preaching, they were arrested. They were thrown into prison. And during the night, an angel delivered them from out of the prison. The next morning, they were found out there preaching again. They were arrested again. And the authorities said, didn't we tell you not to preach? And then verse 29 of chapter 5 says, Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than man. And you know, we see a lot of examples of this same sort of thing, of the righteous having to disobey civil law, going back through the scriptures. You remember the midwives, whenever they ignored the law, Pharaoh's order to kill all the Hebrew baby boys, or Moses resisting Pharaoh's refusal to allow the Israelites to leave Egypt, David fleeing and hiding from Saul. And that, by the way, was a protracted civil disobedience. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's refusal to worship Nebuchadnezzar's idol. Daniel refused to stop praying even though he was prohibited by the law to do so. So then, as now, the civil government is no better than those who are in authority at that time. Our founding fathers, I am amazed at our Constitution, Declaration of Independence, all of those, our founding fathers, at their foresight. But John Adams says, we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Morality and religion, of course, referring to the Bible. He says there's no government that has the power to govern an immoral, irreligious people. And again, that's another thing that scares me about where we seem to be heading here in this country. Now, we realize that if it comes down to we have to make a decision to obey the law or to obey civil government, we realize that we have to obey God. But that doesn't mean you can disregard a civil law just because you don't like it. And we tend to want to do that sometimes too. But I pray that we will never see the time in this country that we have to buck the civil government in order to be obedient to God. One last point, and I saved this one for last. We've seen Jesus' respect for civil law and his absolute obedience to civil law. But there are two things that we really need to consider when we're talking about that obedience. One that we just covered is if it violates God's law, we got to go with God. But the second one, we need to be aware that sometimes the civil government, the civil law, can exert a bad influence on us. Now that may shock you for me to say that. But Jesus said in Mark 8:15, "Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod." Now the leaven principle, of course, we understand that how just a little bit of leaven goes a long way. You just a pinch of leaven. It's kind of like with rat poison that you got some perfectly good food and you add just a little dash of strychnine or arsenic and it's deadly. But the rest of it's all good. Well, we have to kind of look at it that way. The leaven of the civil government. Herod here was representative of civil government, and that sneering, rationalistic unbelief, free thought, cunning worldliness, manifesting itself in political corruption. So, you ask then, how does the government pose a threat to us? How does it act as leaven? Corruption at the top filters down to the masses. If cheating and lying and stealing are permissible for our civil government leaders, surely a little bit of that must be okay for me. I'm not going to do it in a big way. If civil government passes a law that it's legal to take the life of an unborn child, well, it's already done that, or to assist in euthanasia, that lack of respect for the sanctity of life filters down to the masses, sometimes even to the Lord's church. But you wonder sometimes if that's part of the reason for all of these killings, is we've lost the respect for the sanctity of life. If the civil government passes a law that allows divorce for any reason, oops, they've already done that, then that can filter down to the Christians, buying into that sin. The thing is, this kind of influence is subtle, it's slow. We may not even be aware of it, but it's there. We become conditioned to it. Just like the filth on TV and in some of our movies. If you watch TV very much, it conditions you to some of that filthy language and some of the filthy activities. And you get accustomed to that to where you no longer think it's strange or unusual. And remember this, just because the civil law makes something legal does not make it acceptable to God. Jesus said, beware. And we'll close with just a brief summation. Our Lord has provided us a marvelous example in a variety of ways, but in particular for our subject tonight, He is our example in His relationship with the civil government. And while Jesus defended civil government, He made it perfectly clear that obedience to God comes first. He acknowledged civil law's authority to perform weddings and such like, while condemning the law on divorce. Jesus wasn't intimidated by civil law. And in fact, He reminds us that He voluntarily submitted to civil authority. And Jesus explained in no uncertain terms that His kingdom was not and is not in competition with civil government. Jesus respected civil government. He obeyed civil government. but he said, keep a careful eye on it. And surely we can do no less. I thank you for your attention. Bruce, we'll turn it back over to you.